Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a quick minute to get the rest of the attendees on, and then we'll be making a prompt start. So thank you and good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Creating Sustainable Education Estates. Some of you will already know me. I'm Jane O'Leary, and for the past 12 years I've worked for the Vale of Glamorgan Local Authority. While at the Vale of Glamorgan, we had a climate change emergency bill passed through by the council, and in order to look at how we could recommend against that, the schools estate looked at how we could deliver low carbon school buildings. And as part of those low carbon school buildings, the first of those will open in this September. I know many of you in the audience today will be on that same journey to net zero carbon by 2050, and that as every day passes, we're a day nearer getting to that point, and how are we going to get there? As my new role with ISG as Strategic Advisor for Education, I'm only too aware of all of the issues that educationists, local authorities, universities and operators of school buildings have, and how we move from operating, building and maintaining our buildings forward into the new net zero world. So when the opportunity arose to work with Education Estates Online, I was only too happy to take part, because it's a challenge that all of us are facing. Educational Estates Online are a connector, really. They're a conduit that joins us all together, and they're a champion of sharing insights, challenges, learning, and really that's what this event is all about today, is how we can share our thoughts across these areas. Property and construction has a significant part to play in helping us to achieve that net zero target. And when we look at it, a quarter of all the global emissions come from buildings. So that just shows how big a part we all have to play in getting to the net zero. And if we're going to get to net zero, we've got to cut down the amount of energy we're using, and to do that we've got to make our buildings much more efficient in the way that they operate. All of us at ISG believe the only way that we can get there is through collaboration, and through collaboration we can hopefully get to help the shared responsibility that we've all got to get to net zero carbon. And to help our clients on that journey to net zero carbon, we've commissioned a research and insight piece, which is called the Sustainable Buildings Monitor. Now, just before I introduce the panelists that we've got today, I've just outlined what this report is, and what the report does. It takes publicly available data on emissions and the energy consumed by the commercial sector across the UK. And then what you can do is you can look by sector or by region to see where those emissions and energy use is. And what this means is that this report will help us flag where there is the most work to do, whether that be a sector or a region. And then it'll allow us to focus our energies on that, so that we can make the most significant impact on the areas that need it most. And the report also highlights where there's innovation that's happening to tackle some of these problems that are there. I'm sure that everyone will agree that's on the call today that we need to collaborate to find the right answers. And we hope that our report and this discussion today will help demystify some of that journey that we're on, and to get on that readiness scale, really. And by bringing together some of the industry's experts here today, we can examine what we need to do to scale up across the sector to drive what we need to do to get to net zero. So I'd like to next introduce the panellists who I'm delighted that have joined us today here. I'll start with Peter Kelly. Good morning, Peter. Peter is the Group Director of Sustainable Operations for ISG. And Peter leads the team within ISG's sustainable strategy encompassing net zero, carbon, the circular economy, social value, environmental enhancement, and he works across the business to develop and implement new and innovative techniques to ensure that ISG deliver sustainable solutions. Next on the panel, we've got John French. Good morning, John.
Good morning. Hey.
And John is a fellow and senior advisor at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, a leader in sustainable development with a background in biological sciences and institutional academic development. John is active in the field of low carbon innovation, the built environment and architecture. He has a significant experience in major university capital grant funded projects and venture investment to support the transition to net zero carbon economy, as well as delivering and managing enterprise and innovation networks for the university-based knowledge transfer. Next up, we've got Peter Kelly. Hi there, Phil.
Oh, Phil, hi.
Oh, sorry, did I say that? Phil Kelly, who
not
is
related,
director,
I promise.
Not Peter, all brothers. Phil is the Director and Head of Department of Sustainable Solutions for Ramboll. Phil has extensive experience in technical analysis with over 14 years experience in low energy buildings. Phil has also worked with SIBSI, the UK Green Building Council and Association of Consulting Engineers Sustainability Groups. He works primarily across the Oxford and Cambridgeshire area and over the last 10 years in the higher education sector. Phil has led the energy and sustainability strategy for some of the most complex buildings in the sector. And then we've got Tim Davis. Good morning, Tim. Tim is the Director at Waterman Building Services. Tim heads up the Manchester office of Waterman and has been actively involved in design and management of building services for over 23 years. Tim is a chartered engineer and a member of the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers and has previously participated in preparation and publication of SIBSI guides. Tim is also a registered SIBSI low carbon consultant. So we've got a number of questions that we're going to pose to the panel today, but there's also the opportunity for you in the audience if you'd like to post questions, and we'll do a Q&A at the end of the session. So please get posting away with those questions for us. So first of all, Peter, I'd like to come to you if you'd like to outline the findings of the report itself.
Thanks, Jane. Morning, everybody. I'll crack on because we're conscious of time. This graph is really about myth busting some of the common things that people come up with around why, if we just get all the electricity to renewables, why would that not be our solution, and why would that not mean that we are net zero carbon? So the UK GBC did some research into this and showed by 2050 we would achieve a capacity around renewables of 374 terawatt hours of electricity. As you can see at the minute, we're using around 944. So regardless of that capacity for renewables, we really need to reduce the amount of energy we use. That's circa 60%. But if you look at Science Based Targets Initiative, or LETI, they're saying for buildings alone, we'll need to go beyond that to around 80% reduction. So regardless of renewables capacity, we still need to reduce the amount of energy we use across our estates significantly. Now, the next slide is not meant to teach anybody on this call to suck eggs. All it meant to do is highlight what areas that we need to concentrate on when we're measuring our performance against net zero carbon, but also to point out that we often miss the maintenance, fit out, refurbishment and end of life part of embodied carbon and whole life carbon. So it's really important that those two areas are not forgotten. And that leads to the circular economy, where when we look at maintenance, fit out, refurbishment, end of life, the materials, the solutions that we have in these buildings must be repurposed, refurbished, remanufactured with the lowest energy possible if we're really going to meet that net zero carbon. So recycling just cannot be the norm if we're going to achieve those targets by 2050. So some of the key statistics that came out of our Sustainable Buildings Monitor report, I'm not going to go through them all in detail. There's two key points here, really. First of all, that the education sector has a lot of properties, up to 41,000 dotted across the UK, and they use a significant amount of the UK's energy use, up to 5.7% if you exclude domestic buildings. So a lot of properties, a lot that potentially need reducing their energy to if we're going to get to that net zero carbon by 2050. And again, the final slide just again highlights the enormity of the challenge that faces us. We're looking at roughly around a use of 191 kilowatt hours per metre squared in our education sector at the minute. If we're going to get to net zero carbon, that needs to be somewhere between 55 and 70. If you speak to Letty, it's around about 65%, which again is that 2/3 reduction. And we haven't got a lot of time to do this. 29 years works out at roughly 10,500 days. So that's the point of today, is to really discuss, are we all ready? Are we on that path? And if not, then we need to be if we're going to achieve that target by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that, which leads nicely into the first of the questions that we've got. And that is, what are the barriers that the education sector will have to overcome to reach net zero carbon by 2050? And if I can start, Peter, with you with that question. Thanks, Jane. Well, as I've just highlighted in those slides, really, the big barrier is that refurbishment of the existing estates. Certainly ISG, and I'm sure others across our industry, the construction industry, there are many that are achieving net zero carbon or will achieve net zero carbon with new builds. We've got a couple of schools, as you mentioned, Jane, that we're working on at the minute that will be complete in the next 12 or so months. It's that refurbishment of the existing estate which is the issue. And if you look at roughly £1,500 per metre squared for refurbishment, then that is about 34 billion over the next 25 years we need to find to get that refurbishment going. So we think we can do it. We've got the skill set, we just need the money. The other issue is obviously that you can't shut a school down for 9 months when you're doing refurbishments. So we need to look carefully at the solutions, how we work out that strategy with the local authorities so that schools can remain open while they're being refurbished. We might have to look at temporary buildings, modular, that kind of thing. But we need the money to get going, and then we need to make sure that those schools can remain open when they're being refurbished. Thank you. And can I ask that same question of you, Phil? What do you think the barriers will be?
I think one of the key barriers is that we need to be better at sharing of data. The more we collaborate towards common goals and share that data, the better we're going to be able to translate net zero on paper into reality. Achieving 55 or 65 kilowatt hours at the end of a design stage on paper using parametric modeling is a great tool that we are absolutely as an industry ready to do right now. But we need to link that up with the case studies and the tangible performance reality that happens after that. The quicker we publish that data, the quicker we publicize those case studies, the quicker we can scale those solutions. Thank you, Phil. And can I ask the same of you, John, please?
I think the big challenge really is to get the clients, the commissioners for buildings, to set very demanding performance targets for buildings. If you have a strong leadership from the client side, and they absolutely state that they want certain performance criteria around energy and carbon, it's more likely to be achieved collaboratively with a good professional and construction team. But then, this there are relatively few projects out there at the moment that have achieved this, and when you look back at how they've been achieved, it's really through effective team working and setting clear targets at the outset.
Thank you, John, for that. And Tim, can I ask that same question of you?
Yes, certainly. Picking up on Peter's point, the main challenge that I see for education estates and across the board really, not just for education, but it's the challenge of the legacy buildings. A number of estates have such a major asset in their building. A lot of them are listed, a lot of them are focused buildings for the education establishment. And but whilst they're wonderful and look great and they're a key point for the establishments, they also create a large carbon burden on the estate. And whilst we can take those buildings and turn them into carbon neutral buildings, it takes a hell of a lot of investment in the building. You know, we can take a gas-fired boiler system, turn it into a heat pump system, but it's a full replacement of everything within that building to suit that, and maybe fabric upgrades as well to make it possible to fit the radiators or heat emitters physically in the room to try and offset the losses from the rather leaky single glazed windows that obviously you can't replace if they're listed. With 30 years between now and 2050, all of these systems should be replaced under the CIBSE recommended life expectancy, but we know that that's not always the case, that these things happen. You extend life expectancy of the buildings. And I think the other element is another picking up on the point was the fact that the funding often comes out all at once and everybody's scrabbling to design at the one time and then install at the one time and install in summer. And so the way that we fund these projects can be a challenge as well to delivering them.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer, Tim. If we move on to the second question that I've got for you as a panel here. So the sector is grappling with the dilemma between new build and refurbishment, and that's something that you've all picked up. What advice would you give to anyone in the audience that's facing that same dilemma? And if I come over to you, John, to start that answer.
Yeah, thank you. Well, with new build, I think it's not particularly hard to set a project on track with very, very demanding low carbon targets. Clearly, I would give advice that you need to look at alternative strategies around procurement and assembling your team, and you need to be prepared to deviate slightly from traditional practices on how you approach a project like this. And I would definitely include a risk management tool that allows you to monitor different stages of the project to see how well you're doing. With refurbishment projects, they're harder because there are fewer case studies around for ultra low carbon projects. I'm working on One Regent Street at the moment with Peter Kelly and ISG. That is a deep retrofit project, and it's probably the first of its kind and of that scale in the UK. We've set an Enefit passive house standard to get the operational energy levels right down. We've adopted BREEAM Outstanding, the WELL standard, and we've also set an embodied carbon target. But critically, we have set that as a 100-year life cycle target. Taking on board the comments that Peter made earlier, we are not wanting to just do that for the construction phase. We want to take on board refurbishment at different stages in the life of the building, and we want to take on board end of life, repurposing and reuse. So my advice would be spend a bit of time looking at the principles of the circular economy, because what we want to do is maximize reuse and repurposing. Make a conscious effort to reuse what is already there so that you can get into the mindset of emissions avoided as well as emissions reduced, because I think that's really critical going forwards. If we're going to use the established historical estate, which we should use, we can't squander it, we have to improve it, then we need to look at ways of enhancing it. And the circular economy does give you a toolkit that allows you to address that.
Thank you, John. And can I come over to you, Phil, for your response to that question?
Yes, a very similar thing, and following on from a couple of words that John just mentioned about life cycle, it is very much about life cycle thinking. It's about thinking in a holistic manner about what the best option between new build, between refurbishment over the entirety of the desired lifespan of that asset. Do you want to squeeze an extra 10, 15 years out of a mini refurb in an asset, or do you want to create a new build that lasts for 60 years? If you can refurbish the asset to make it last 100 years and be adaptable to the teaching needs of the future, then absolutely. But the industry is definitely moving towards this way of thinking, rather than just thinking about the operational phase. We're bringing in the construction, the operation, and the end of life phase. And when you think about these things from a whole life perspective, you get a very different answer, but you need to spend the time to calculate it and understand it in the first place. The benefit that the education industry or the education sector has in this is that you're going to reap the benefits of any additional investment at the start. The payback in either finance or carbon or environmental piece will be felt by the same person over its lifespan. So there's a big opportunity in that, and circular economy, the reduction in embodied carbon, as well as look at that, the operational energy, has to be considered at the same time in parallel.
Thank you, Phil. And can I pass over to Tim now, please?
Yeah, I think the big advice to give to anybody considering this is that it's certainly possible to make massive savings in refurbishment and the carbon emissions of buildings, and it is easier to knock down and start again. And yes, you can make bigger savings, or rather it's easier to make savings with a new build. But that's not to say it can't be done for a refurb, and obviously the savings that you make in the points that both John and Phil have made with embodied carbon and avoiding putting carbon into buildings by retaining them is a massive thing, that game changer and a mindset change that we need to move into. We're currently working on the refurbishment of the velodrome with ISG at the moment, and there we've taken a 1990s building that was built with absolutely no consideration of energy saving at all in the 90s, and my younger engineers look upon us all in disdain at the fact that we didn't reclaim any heat or anything at that time, but that's how we built buildings. And so now the challenge is to take those buildings and apply new technologies and turn them into buildings that can achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and we've done that and shown it can be done. So the biggest advice is, don't just throw away your old buildings thinking that they're lost to you. Seize the benefits of the whole life economy, as we said, in the circular economy, and save that carbon that's in the building and reuse those assets.
Thank you, Tim. And can I pass lastly over to Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I'm wondering whether it's just going to be too expensive going forward to actually demolish. I mean, it's so expensive to build in the UK as it is comparatively across the world. So I'm wondering if the sheer cost model will eventually get to the stage where it will certainly make people think about refurbishment and that life cycle approach that's been discussed much more in depth, to really understand the return on investment, whether it would be best to knock something down or to refurbish it. And I think that's where we are getting to, but we need to get there quicker. We need to make those calls about the return on investment around the capital expenditure versus the operational expenditure to really drive towards that refurbishment, and then that will lead to the carbon, the circular economy and everything else. So I just wonder whether the cost will mean that we'll be pushed towards a refurbishment model anyway, as construction seems to keep getting more and more expensive.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer. If we look to move on to question 3 that we've got here, and this is about saying if you could change one thing or name one thing that you could hope could happen tomorrow to accelerate us towards net zero carbon, what would that be? And if I come to you first, Phil, with that.
With that very simple question, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I suppose it's following on from, I suppose, the last question, and what we've all been saying on the panel so far is that legislation needs to reflect the whole life cycle consideration, the life cycle desire for net zero carbon, not just in one part of that life cycle aspect. Now, if there was a legislation that was to come in that truly incentivized that way of designing, that way of thinking, and that way of quantifying value, of environmental impact, etc., then, and that could trump the either national legislation or local planning policy that only looks at certain aspects, that would really add weight to the embodied carbon discussions, to the circular economy discussions, and not just focus on things like Part L that looks at just the carbon emissions associated with the regulated energy uses in operation. And even that is a generic benchmarking tool, not a real performance-based tool. So if we had a legislation that really forced or incentivized everyone to consider a build project, be refurbishment or new build, in that way, and truly assess the benefits in that manner, that would make a big difference. It would have to be performance based, not compliance based. It would have to be backed up with perhaps mandatory data disclosure to show what you're going to do and what you've actually achieved. And it would then also, I would say, need to be supplemented by a roadmap to removing offsetting, because as soon as we use this word net, we've already got clients, we've always got members and stakeholders within the industry picking upon that very small 3-letter word is net. How much are we actually doing in the design? How much are we doing on site versus how much offsetting are we doing in various different guises? Be that building in timber and hoping that sequestration offsets some of the construction carbon, or is it investing in green offsetting somewhere else in the world? There needs to be all of those things put together.
Thank you, Phil, for that. And can I pass over to you, John, with that same question?
Thanks, Jane. Unfortunately, I don't think there is one silver bullet that's going to fix this. If I take circular economy, we can definitely help the circular economy by setting a performance-based standard for that. At the moment, many of us use a number of different validation tools to get building performance measured, ranging from BREEAM, LEED, WELL. I've set our own standards for embodied carbon, and we don't have a standard for circular economy. So if we're going to go down this road of saying we value historic assets, conservation assets, and refurbishment matters in terms of energy, carbon, and cost, then we need to have performance indicators for the circular economy. So that's my big number one item. My equally other big number one item is somebody's got to fund this from somewhere. And at the moment, we're struggling to work out how we can fund getting to zero, because it's going to mean deeper retrofits, much more intervention in buildings than has been the case in the past, deep interventions that last longer. We need a financial tool to do that. We need the energy savings, the cost savings that are delivered through these enhancements to be capitalised up front with various forms of green challenge funds or green investment strategies, or investment opportunities, so that institutions and businesses can access that resource to spend the money up front to get these improvements. That structure doesn't exist at the moment. Universities and colleges in particular are basically having to dip into their own pockets to look at 8 to 10% uplift on cost on projects to get Passive House standard, but they don't actually have complete confidence that they will get that back. They just have to wait and see. So we need to de-risk it for people. Unless we de-risk it for the universities and colleges, they're going to say that's too much for us to take on board right now, given all the other things we have to finance.
Thank you, John. And I think we're seeing that already, where people are looking at their estates to look at them to be net zero, and as you say, certainly in the FE and HE sector, and then seeing the price tag that comes with that, and are just saying we'll leave that for another day because we can't physically fund it at the moment. So I do definitely think that's something that we'll need to look at. If I come over to you, Peter.
Yeah, I was going to echo the same point that John made around finding us the money, really. I think we've got the solutions. It's just about finding that 34 billion or so. It seems to me that the government, not meaning to get too political, can seem to find the money for lots of different things when they need to, but they don't seem to perhaps put the same emphasis on this as we would hope. So I don't know how we overcome that, but certainly getting the government to find or to support a solution that would work for the financing would be would do a lot to help, I think. I know they've had a lot of ideas around the retrofit of our homes, etc., that haven't quite come to fruition for whatever reason. So yeah, finding a model that works. I think we just need to get on with it. I think there's, as John said, there's going to be more and more case studies that come out of these deep retrofits that will allow others to follow in our path. So there's a lot of pledging going on at the moment, as you can well imagine, across the industry, pledges to this, that and the other. So those pledges need to be followed up with some action. And what we're trying to emphasize today is that there isn't a lot of time. So those pledges need to turn into some action pretty quickly around how we're going to do this. So get on with it and find some money from somewhere to make it work.
Thank you, Peter. Can I hand over to you, Tim, for the same question?
Yeah, I think picking up on the same theme that's going through here, which is obviously funding, and to achieve the net zero contributions, we've all accepting that there's obviously a large impetus of money required, because we are changing, certainly from a building services point of view, changing the way that our buildings are serviced in that fashion. So building on the question, which was what could we hope for? I would hope for a magic silver bullet to resolve all these problems. And I kind of think that possibly the government is hanging their hat on that to a certain extent as well, that somewhere along the line a solution will appear. One of the potentials for this is obviously the hydrogen fuel network. And if we could deliver hydrogen fuel down a network that can support it, and obviously our current network at the moment can't support it, although it's being upgraded. If we could deliver hydrogen to the education estates, certainly part of the point I made earlier about the investment to go from a standard boiler system to a heat pump system involves a full replacement of everything inside. If you could just swap out your boiler for a hydrogen fuel boiler and achieve the carbon that come with hydrogen fuel as opposed to burning natural gas, you could retain all of the internal heat emitters, pipework, flow rate, pumps, all the rest of it would stay the same because your flow and return temperatures are the same. And it's a far less investment burden for the clients and the education establishments. Takes up the same amount of space, you don't need bigger plant rooms, etc. So I think if we were looking for the most possible silver bullet that might get us as far as we can in a short amount of time, then bringing hydrogen fuel into systems, bringing boilers into systems, gives clients a cheaper way to achieve a larger carbon saving. Obviously, it is still generated with using electricity, but it does provide you the benefit of achieving the carbon savings as opposed to just carrying on burning natural gas. So I think that would be my one hope. And the other spin on that would also be incentives. At the moment, there aren't enough incentives to achieve this at this point. Now, that may be an incentive in financial terms, or it may be an incentive through a taxation point in there. And as you quite rightly said, Jane, we've done a number of studies for establishments where they just see the price tag of achieving carbon neutrality and look at their funding and think, oh, I'd sooner spend that on better teaching walls and better screens and better education facilities rather than carbon. I don't have to do the carbon now. I haven't got enough money to do both, so I'll choose the education experience of the student over the carbon savings. So that needs to be redressed either with more funding or some other way to force people to actually seriously look at this carbon agenda from that point. Yep.
Thank you, Tim. I think the hydrogen fuel is a very interesting point, and it will be very interesting to see where that does take us, because as you say, that's the simple solution, if you like, in lots of ways, but it's whether we'll be ever be able to produce enough hydrogen to operate everything. I mean, there's lots of other what ifs that go with it. So I think, probably we're going to be looking at a mixed solution, aren't we? And I think that's what's come out from the panel today, that we need to look at a mix of things. So if I can move on to the fourth question that we've got for you, panel, and that's, how do you think the public and private sectors can collaborate to achieve net zero carbon? So we've heard a lot from everybody about collaboration today, but how do we think the public and private sector can collaborate? And if I start with you, Tim, with that.
Yeah, I think at the moment, when we look towards 2050 and carbon savings, I kind of think that we don't have all the answers yet to how to get there. And I think that's a key point. For the past 10, 11 years, we've been trying to achieve carbon savings, and we've achieved a lot when you look back to the buildings that we were building. But we've gone through a process of throwing old technology at the new problem of achieving that. And when we look back to what we were trying to do, let's say 8 years ago, when the big craze was biomass boilers and everybody thought biomass was the solution and it was wonderful and it achieved carbon neutrality and you was in your heating systems, and effectively all we'd done was dug out a 1950s coal-fired boiler, shoved it into a building and put some wood in it and said, there you go. Not the solution, wasn't the way. It imposed a whole host of other issues that came along with regards to air quality and other elements. So I still think we're throwing old technology at a new problem, and therefore I think the answer is just not being found yet. And the only way we're going to get to that is the collaboration between private and public sector and education establishments to achieve the research from there. And as we all know, necessity being the mother of invention, if we have a problem, we have the education establishments that can provide the facilities, the people, and the ability to generate the solutions, and we'll need the private sector to fund that element and to support them through that process, so that in 10 years' time, as we're very fast approaching 2050, something else is developed, be it carbon capture, be it whatever is in the pipeline to get to there. But I do think that that's the only way we're going to achieve this as a true solution, because we've got to look beyond 2050 as well. We can't get to 2050 and go, yes, we've made it, and then run out of renewable energy in 2051. So we need to be looking towards it in a truly sustainable way and thoroughly looking for new technology to keep us moving.
Thank you, Tim. Can I ask Phil? Can I ask that same question of you? How do you think the collaboration between the public and private sector?
Absolutely, I entirely agree with Tim's comments on there. There's been a long-standing collaboration in translating the theory and the brightest minds, solving problems of today and tomorrow, and then taking the private industry and trying to demonstrate that it works, but not just a single scale, but on a grand scale as well. And I think there will continue to be that collaboration. What we're finding, however, to go on a slightly different slant of net zero carbon, is that working with the likes of World Green Building Council, WBCSD as well, is that this transition has got to be done in a just way at the same time. And a lot of the funders, a lot of investors, a lot of private clients are looking to quantify and ensure that in their ESG policies, the S, the social aspect, is taken as important as the environmental impact as well. And the education industry in itself has very much social mobility and the social value at its absolute core. So I think there is going to be perhaps even more links towards net zero carbon, whereby private firms of the private sector and the public sector will be able to meet in the middle and be able to facilitate the net zero carbon technological transition, but also make sure that both the environmental and the social aspects of that are done in an equally fair manner. And I think that is the most sustainable way of achieving net zero carbon, rather than taking an initial push that has an inevitable backlash.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for that. And can I pass over to John now with that same question?
Thanks, Jane. Before I answer it, I have to say I think 2050 is too far into the future. You know, we have a crisis now with climate change, so we need to be thinking in much shorter timetable terms than we are at the moment. and everybody signed up to 1.5 degrees temperature rise through the Paris Protocol. I don't remember agreeing to that. Politicians agreed to that. It's too high, but at the moment we're on track to exceed that, probably 4 degrees. So we've got a bit of an existential crisis on our hands. So we have to mobilise the private and public sector to work effectively together to deal with this. For me, the biggest gap is around technology innovation. I mean, I've heard the comment a moment ago about deploying old technologies into a new problem. Most of the things we're doing on our projects at the moment are redeploying existing heat pump technologies or heat recovery technologies, or in some cases, some new innovation around insulation and airtightness. But we're still struggling to get to zero carbon. Our university set an absolute zero target, not a net zero target. That means absolute zero. We will struggle to get to that without the private sector funding innovation, putting venture capital support into accelerating new startups and new commercial opportunities around innovation in technology, new insulation technologies, new glazing technologies, smart materials, biotech, materials that absorb CO2 out of the atmosphere, that can be integrated or materially included in your design of your building, so that in future it's not just a passive structure, it is actively removing CO2 as part of its life cycle. That piece does not yet exist, but using existing technologies, which we can't get there. We'll get close, but we won't get to zero. So I think for me, it is deploying public and private partnerships in venture capital and investment to accelerate technology, and to do that on a much more fast track accelerated basis than we have historically, because we tend to do research over 20 or 30 year timetable. We can't afford to wait that long. In this case, we need to accelerate it a lot faster.
Thank you, John. If I hand over to you, Peter, for your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Jane. It's always difficult coming last, isn't it? Because everyone's made some great points already. But from my perspective, there's great opportunity here for the private sector when you look at the demand in the public sector. So, you know, the public sector needs support over here with a massive estate to get it to retrofit it. You've got the private sector that's set up to do this. It'll be the private sector companies that work out how to finance this in a way that works for both parties that will really gain the benefit of this. And we're already looking internally at ISG at how we might finance a model to refurbish to net zero carbon where possible. You know, whether that's fully financed and we take some risk around the performance over the 15-20 year lifespan, whatever it might be. So we're already having those conversations internally about how we might work towards a solution that could be retrofitted that would aim to not only achieve that net zero carbon or very close to it, but also help the financing along the way. And I think that's where there needs to be some thought piece around the traditional model of construction that perhaps doesn't work particularly well for getting to net zero carbon either, with the sheer number of suppliers, contractors, different people involved in a project life cycle just for the construction phase. That needs to be looked at in terms of how we're all financed, how we're all incentivized to get towards a goal that works for the public sector, as opposed to the traditional capital model of everyone making money along the way, and then taking that into the operation of the building and making sure that that building performs to net zero carbon throughout its life cycle. So I think there's massive opportunities here, and if people can use that innovative thinking and look at the problem in a different way to the way we're currently looking at it, then there'll be some big winners going forward.
Thank you for that. Thank you, panel, for your views on those questions that we've posed. I know we've had a lot of questions posed by the audience, so that's going to be the next section that we're going to go into. So I'm going to pass over now to Holly Passmore from Education Estates, who is going to do the Q&A for the questions that have been raised by the audience. So if I can pass over to you now, Holly.
Hi there. Thanks, Jane. It's great to be here. And as you said, what an informative and interesting discussion so far. So for the next 20 to 25 minutes, I'm just going to go through some of the questions and I'll direct each one to the panel to kick off. So Peter, I'm going to direct this at you initially. So do you think users have a role to play in carbon reduction? If so, how can we educate them to improve efficiency?
Of course, yeah, it's really important that the people that are actually going to use, interact, learn in those buildings have the education in order to use that building properly. But I think the biggest issue that surrounds that at the minute is that we don't make it easy enough for people to understand how they should interact with the building. And it's like anything in life, if you make it easy for somebody, they're much more likely to do it. So I think we need to think again. There's been a lot of conversation about innovation and technology. We need to look to harness that innovation in technology, obviously in a low energy way, to really enhance the experience for those that are using these buildings in order to understand if they're being energy inefficient and what they can do to stop that inefficiency, whether that's the usual traditional turn the lights off, turn the screens off when you leave a room, all the way through to the maintenance and operation of those buildings, what's left on overnight or whatever it might be. So I think we've got to make it easier for those people to understand and use the building in a way that leads to that reduction in energy use.
Yep, definitely. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that in the panel? John, shall I pass to you?
Yeah, I think that it's very important when you do the brief at the start of a project, what we call, nowadays we call it REBA Stage 0, Strategic Outline Business Case. It's very important that you consult the user as part of that process. And ideally, you should run a workshop or a design charrette workshop where you actually get the users to inform the thinking for the brief before you actually launch the project. So I would always advocate that approach, and then keep the user group. Most universities, colleges, schools will have a project board for a major capital project. Keep the user group as an important committee that feeds into your project board that can keep track of whether or not the user needs and the user aspirations that integrate all these sustainability factors are actually being maintained and adhered to, so you keep it alive, especially when you get to the end of the project. It all gets very stressful at the end of a capital project. You don't lose sight of these things as you move through the project life.
Perfect. Thank you, John and Peter. So this next question I'm going to direct to Phil. How do we see local authorities getting organised for the challenge, and who are the emerging exemplars in this area?
So they have a big role to play. I think it would be remiss not to mention the fact that only a few weeks ago the new London Plan was formally adopted, and that is starting to move in the direction that we need to see it. So yes, it's incorporating the ethos behind decarbonisation of the grid, and it is pushing that operational energy towards an electrified, decarbonised future. But the requirements to also, the mandatory requirements to now do a full life cycle assessment, which is brand new. There's also a new requirement to provide a circular economy statement. That is new as well, which is very good. And also you've got the Be Seen. We had the Be Lean, the Be Clean and Be Green sections, so your passive, active and then renewable strategies for reducing energy. But now that validation approach, that fourth stage of actually validating what you achieved is also come into to effect. So it's a good start. I think the challenge is that whilst you have to do a life cycle assessment and a statement, you don't have to commit to achieving a number. So the GLA are going to be sat on a gold mine of data in the next few years. All of these LCAs undertaken by all the large schemes in London, all having to provide that carbon data, they are going to be sat on a wealth of information that will perhaps help the industry create better benchmarks, better comparative measures. So that's one that I would certainly lean towards at the moment. But it also, I think what I've found in the last 10 years actually is that when going to pre-app meetings with planning authorities and when going to interactive sessions to discuss our designs, a lot more authorities are having to invest in getting the people on the right side of the table to come and have that conversation with us, because their policies may or may not, maybe perhaps not through the fault of their own, may be pushing us down the wrong avenue the age-old Merton rule of 10% renewables is starting at the end of that process, focusing on renewables before you've exhausted all the other aspects. But for us to go to the table and say, actually, we think we've got a better way of doing it, we need the confidence on the other side of the table to say, okay, well, let's explore that, let's understand it. And if it is going to be technically non-policy compliant, we need to be able to support it as a better option.
Thanks for that. Tim, have you got anything to add to that question?
Yeah, I've been worked with a number of councils. I think the simple answer is some do it a lot better than others, but not all of them are doing it perfectly well. I think joined up approaches between different departments is always difficult. Funding schemes and funding avenues are obviously, again, coming back down to the way that funding is released, can be a bit disjointed and can work against when scenarios where one scheme where I'm working on, suddenly another part of the building got funding for a ground source heat pump potentially coming in that we didn't know about. So it would have been good to have shared that knowledge into a combined holistic arrangement. So definitely from that point of view, there's ways that things can be improved. I think everybody's working towards the right angle and trying to get there. I think everybody's rushing there, and people should just take a bit of a step back, a breathing space, and do it in a more coordinated fashion in that way. But coming back down to the point of, do they have a key role? Yes, they do have a key role. As you said, John, 2050 is too far away, and councils have been bringing it forward from that point, and they've taken the lead on that to the 2030, 2038, where, depending on where you are into there. So yeah, there is a major key position to play in it. But again, picking up on Phil's point, I think it's very key that there isn't one solution. We should come at this from all angles. So long as we're saving carbon in whatever we do, then that should be good and that should be allowed. So the approach should be more flexible, and they need to understand that that we do have other solutions, not just a prescribed bolt on a renewable bit of PV or something.
Thanks for that, Tim. Okay, so is the design and build structure of construction giving design responsibility to the M&E contractors the main issue? Would the panel agree this isn't fit for purpose in terms of value engineering all the good things out? John, would you like to start with that one, please?
I hate value engineering. You're not allowed to even use the word, because so many projects you lose the performance that you're looking for in a building because of value engineering. So yes, I really struggle with that. I think that's quite a complex question, because you've rolled into it M&E and also design and build as a methodology, whoever asked that question. So I would say that the valuation of a project right at the start is often far too based on estimated costs around M&E. And often I've seen the kind of cost estimates that go with renewable schemes, air source heat pumps, cascade ventilation systems, getting overvalued and overpriced at the early stages of a project, which has the consequence of putting the client off. Then the other thing that happens with two-stage design and build is you have firstly a set of designers doing the initial work with the client, then another set of designers doing it with the contractor. That can lead to, I think, unnecessary additional cost in some cases, but I wouldn't want to generalize. So I think the answer to your question is make sure you interrogate the cost estimates very early on a project and challenge them at the first possible hurdle. There's not that much experience in the sector of costing passive house buildings and ultra low carbon buildings, and as a result cost estimates tend to be very risk averse and can push the project outside of its comfort zone too soon.
Perfect, thanks for that. Does anybody else have any comments on that one?
I think a key point as an M&E designer, definitely you set out with a target to achieve, and you try and achieve a client's goals. And yes, that it comes down to something that John mentioned earlier, which was setting the brief. set your brief, set your parameters, set your targets, set the prescripted arrangements, and therefore the problems that you get with D&B aren't there, because there's no wriggle room from that point. So long as you're clear in your brief and you're clear in what you need, then you'll get that. If you leave it ambiguous and there's scope for change, then obviously under the D&B process, cost will run and be king in that process. So yeah, set your brief.
I think a bit just to jump in there as well, is that clients need to set realistic cost plans and realistic budgets for projects as well, because quite often you've got all that good stuff being done that Tim's spoken about, but then an unrealistic budget to be able to deliver against it, and then you end up in that horrible world that John spoke about of value engineering, which isn't value engineering, it's cutting costs to get the project to meet your budget, which is all that value engineering is about. So I do think that clients need to be realistic about the budgets that they set on the outset of these projects, and as we get more data, that should help people set more realistic budgets up there as well.
And I think it's just worth adding to that one, there's nothing wrong with D&B. D&B is a good process. It brings the knowledge of the contractor to the table at the same time as the knowledge of the designer, and welds the two together. So it's don't think it's a bad route to go. If done correctly, I think is the solution.
In line with what you were saying about set the brief right and also quantify it right, if you're, regardless of the procurement methodology, if you have an operational energy model and you have a life cycle assessment quantifying the embodied carbon, and you present that in the tender pack and you say, this is our target, this is what we want to achieve. If you want to slightly change the spec or make slight changes, you have to re-engage with those two documents and make sure that you haven't amended our targets. That's perhaps coming across as overly simplistic, but that is a way of intentionally maintaining the end goal whilst allowing a certain amount of flexibility to make sure you've got that price competitiveness.
That's some really good points highlighted there. Thank you everybody for jumping in.
To say one last comment is that one thing we've really noticed at CISL in particular is that the client hasn't deviated once from their requirements, and they have been firm all the way through the process about what they want to achieve. And that hasn't allowed any significant change to occur, only change to occur that either improves the solution or gets the solution once we've found obstacles along the way. And I think that's really, really important and refreshing to have a client that is unwavering in its requirements and will not deviate from them regardless of which contractor or which design team is involved.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Okay, so Tim, I think you'd be good to answer this one. So does the panel see a holistic approach to microgrids, on-site generation off-grid, and integration with BEMS and battery storage as the way forward?
Yes. I think the main point of all of that is there's a combination of systems need to work together, and there isn't, coming back down to the aspirations, there isn't a single solution to the problem. So it is going to be a multitude of different elements working together to achieve our green grid, as it were. And yes, microgeneration has benefits. It's not the solution entirely. Central generation obviously is always going to have a requirement, albeit with all the issues that come with that. And storage, battery storage, the use of smart grid is obviously key as well to smoothing out the peaks and the troughs and delivering a stable electric future for the country moving forward. So it is all of those factors all come into it, and on top of that, the new technology we haven't known about yet, that all function and come into it in ways that we don't know as yet. But yes, it all contributes together into one holistic element, which brings with it the problems that, as we were saying, to do that you have to have a joined up approach. because you can't have somebody throwing a bit of battery in here and something else over there and a little micro generation set over there. It has to be led in the by the councils, by the local establishments, and also then by the central government as well, because it has to all be developed together. Otherwise, you're going to get inefficiencies and areas that are under provided and areas that are over provided, which wouldn't benefit anybody.
Perfect. Does anybody else have anything to add?
I think if we revert all the way back to maybe the start of the presentation, Peter put up a slide showing the reduction in demand versus the increase in renewables. That is, that gigawatt hour figure was over a year. But I remember in the news, it was in June 2017, it came up and it said the grid has gone below 90 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. And there are many websites out there that can look at the detail behind that. By the time it got to 6 o'clock on the very same day, it had gone straight back up to 160 again. So yes, battery storage and evening out those peaks and troughs is absolutely necessary, but there's no incentivization at the moment. Partel doesn't recognize it or give any credence or benefit to the use of battery storage. There's no feed-in tariff equivalent that brought the price of PV panels down substantially in an incredibly short period of time. But again, if we're talking, going back to that word net, that net zero carbon, if you aggregate over such a long period of time, we need to look at the granularity behind that as well on a daily and a seasonal aspect, not just an overall annual average.
Thanks for jumping in there, Phil. Okay, Peter, I'm going to ask this question to you. What is your view on the choices of materials? Do you think materials have a big impact?
Oh, yes, definitely. Materials. Well, let's see if there's anybody from concrete or steel or timber on the call, because they usually have very strong opinions about the benefits of the different major materials that we use, particularly structurally. So yes, of course, materials play a massive role. And I know there is a lot of work going on in the steel world and in the concrete world at trying to reduce the embodied carbon considerably. What role has timber got to play going forward? Perhaps hasn't taken off quite as much as we might have expected to date. Whether Grenfell has had an impact on that, we wait to see. So yes, the materials is massive when it comes to embodied carbon. And again, we're seeing it more and more that design teams are taking that into consideration, where they're doing LCA analysis at the start to try and look at their clients and persuade their clients to have, for example, second-hand raised access flooring, which has a huge embodied carbon impact, or to look at refurbishment over demolition. So huge impact. And I think if we could get the tools a bit slicker and a bit quicker to use, then they'll start to have a bigger impact in those choice of materials going forward.
John, do you have any thoughts on materials?
Yes, I mean, I've just been going through a major master planning exercise for a business park, actually, up in North Cambridge, and all of our new buildings will be timber framed, sawn timber, low energy, passive designed structures, fire compliant to the highest possible standard. The only concrete will be in the base plate for thermal stability and heat and cool. So that does ping up our embodied carbon a bit. Embodied carbon in construction. I'm a great fan, but I'm a biologist, so I would be a great fan of natural materials and natural products. They have huge value, especially new build, for biogenic storage of carbon. But that only stacks up if you have a long life in your building and you have a plan for how you're going to disassemble it at the end of life. Because if you take the material and use it, stick it into a wood burner or incinerate it, you're returning that carbon back to the atmosphere. You've achieved nothing in geological time terms. But if you've got an end-of-life cycle approach and all that material is going to get reused or repurposed, or even better, the building doesn't have a life cycle end point, you've actually designed in permanence refurbishment into its future, so you never have to disassemble it, then of course you're permanently locking up carbon in bio-based materials in construction. That has to be the way to go for me. So I think the challenge is, how do we overcome problems or unnecessary risk that's around the certification and use of bio-based materials to put people's mind at rest, because you can use them, you can get them fire certified, and you can test them. So I think for me personally, I'm a great fan of timber, but also biocomposites and a whole range of new emerging biomaterials that will change the face of construction. What I'm against, I think, is just filling a building full of carbon sinks just for the sake of it, when it just tweaks your embodied carbon data, but it isn't actually a faithful or an authentic approach to carbon storage. So I think you need to watch out for that as part of the design process.
Jane, have you got any thoughts? Thought I'd bring you in.
I think one of the things, and we've talked about it in lots, is, and I think Peter mentioned it, it's also about measurement and having, for me, it's about one source of the truth with what these materials actually contain for embodied carbon, because we've got lots of systems out there. We've got lots of ways that people are measuring it. There's lots of tools to help us. But we're at that point where we've got no consistency across the industry. So we need to get to that point where we're getting the data that we can truly believe about our materials with regard to the embodied carbon, and also that we've got the tools there that we can consistently use to be able to measure it as well. So that would be my thoughts.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask maybe another 2 questions. Phil, going to come to you. So how do we stop capital cost and contractors' insecurities with tendering slowing or missing net zero by 2050?
Well, that's a good question. Well, again, going back to something actually that John has said a number of times, that ultimately the client has got to drive the brief and got to have an unwavering commitment to the solutions that they want at the end. And there has to be also an ongoing commitment towards the performance of that asset once it's been completed, the commissioning process followed by the defects period, etc. There's got to be a long-term ownership of that. And we're finding lots of examples whereby yes, capital costs and the tendering process is one thing, and the different procurement methods that we've talked about, but there is an ongoing commitment. I've sent on a number of tables whereby there is a much longer ongoing commitment from the design team, from the contractor, in terms of guaranteeing the performance of that asset and not running away the minute the keys are handed over. That is a different way of articulating value. Value is now spoken about in many different ways, and it's not just financial. And I think that with the briefing around net zero carbon and around many other aspects, it's becoming a bigger conversation than just money. So I think how to articulate value in many different ways is certainly a way to go.
Peter, have you got any thoughts on that one?
That is a very tough question. That nothing I can really add more than what Phil has said. Really, it's just around ensuring that we stick to what we're trying to achieve at the beginning, and take into consideration some of the operational costs, the capex versus the opex, and not just concentrate on the capex costs. If you look at the operational costs in tandem with the capital expenditure costs, then you're going to get a better answer than if it's one department just looking at the capex costs and they never talk to the people looking at the operational costs.
Thanks, Peter. Okay.
I think I was just going to say that capex opex is such a massive issue, certainly in the public sector, because the two are just completely opposing inside. So it is always really difficult to try and justify that greater capital cost, because you know that there's an operational saving there, and we've still got a lot of work to do with Treasury over that, about trying to bring those budgets together so that we do look at whole life, because that's the way that we need to look at the budget of the building as well, rather than those two separate bits. So it's a massive frustration that I've had for many years.
Good point. Okay, so we've got about 3 minutes to go. So I'm just going to ask one last question. Tim, I'll come to you first, and then if anybody else wants to jump in, we can do that. So in your opinion, are retrofits and refurbishments becoming a want, a need, or both? And how can we encourage the same excitement towards retrofits and refurbishments that we feel towards new builds?
I think the excitement bit is the good bit there. It's the challenge. We need to embrace the carbon saving. If you think of new builds are easy. Where's the fun in doing a new build? It's do a refurb. It's a lot harder to make the carbon savings. So the bigger challenge to the design team to achieve the carbon saving. Overall, the gains are bigger because you've saved all of that embodied carbon in not knocking a building down and rebuilding it. So the way forward has got to be, as we're looking towards saving carbon, not just in operation, in construction as well, is to embrace the existing buildings. There's a lot of good buildings out there. There's a lot of bad buildings as well. Don't get me wrong, they do need replacing. But there are a lot of good buildings, and yes, I think how do we encourage the excitement? It's adopt the challenge. From that point, it's exciting to try lots of different technologies and look at a building and try and understand what happens if you change the glazing, what happens if we change this bit of the door, the air permeability. Really push the existing building as far as you can. That's exciting. That's challenging. As I say, harking back to the cycling centre, that's what we did there. We looked at an existing building and we looked at every avenue that we could explore and pushed it as far as we could and achieve massive carbon savings in that way. So yeah, it's exciting to do that as opposed to just come up with a new build where it's a bit formulaic, isn't it? And it's a bit there for you. You know, there's no challenge in that. So that's my excitement anyway.
I would definitely echo that. I'm sure Tim and I, both being engineering, give us a good spreadsheet and some data, and that's made our day. But the other benefit, the other enjoyment factor about working on refurbishments, unlike new builds, is that you have data. You've got a before and after. That is so much easier to articulate back to the client or back to the end users and the stakeholders. This building consumed X last year. Our target is to make it consume Y a year after completion. You have more data and more tangible. You've got bar charts, you've got pie charts, all that sort of stuff. You could articulate that message so much better rather than something that was not in existence before you constructed it. And that's a much easier thing to sell, I would say.
Jane, do you want to add any final points?
Well, no, and I think that sort of summed it up, because some of this is going to be about convincing clients to change the way that they're thinking. You know, from that new build, you get this sparkly building, and what we need to show is that through our refurbishment project, you can still have that wow factor, but you've got that journey to go through, and I think as an industry we need to be better at articulating all those things that Phil spoke about to the clients, to take them on that same journey as we as an industry are going on.
Can I just make a point on that, Jane? I think that it's a bit like Formula One. Building a new building with all these challenges does help you to test it out. And certainly I found that having done that first on new build and then applying many of these principles to retrofit has helped, because retrofit's so much harder, has so many more technical challenges, and has so many more unexpected problems going to pop up mid-project that you couldn't have anticipated because you just didn't know what you were working with. So I think you need both. And I don't think we should stop building new buildings. I think we should just build new buildings that are zero impact on the planet. But I think we need to share the learning, and I think if we can get a lessons learned model captured more in the industry, so all these projects we learn lessons from, we share it openly and quickly, then that will accelerate the ability of teams to be able to take on these challenges.
I think John has summed it up there really, really well from the whole session today with that. So I know we're running short on time, so I can thank you, Holly, for chairing that session. Thank you very much. A massive thank you to the panelists for your insights and your views. Thank you for all the questions that have been posted, because I think that's what makes it a really interesting session, and I hope everybody has found that. We're going to be sharing the video and the report that we wrote, so look out in your inboxes because you'll be receiving that, and then after that you'll be receiving the insight report that Holly will be putting together from this. If anybody's got any further questions they'd like to ask of us at ISG, we will do our utmost to try and get back to people and answer those. So do the details are there. So do get in touch with us, and if we can help, we certainly will do. And just a big thank you again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.